welcome back everybody. Edwin the Magic Engineer again. And here we are with video 3 and how to build a deck like an engineer. And in this last instance of this video series, I'm going to be going over some of the more fine-tuning refinements that you can put into your tournament deck. We already started with something that was that initial idea spark in video 1 and kind of pulled a bunch of cards from different card pools and put together something. In video 2, I refined it a little bit and I showed a couple methods on how you can kind of draw the deck through and see how the ratios are between like mana and spells, creatures, all that. And then I showed about solo play in video 2, about taking 2 decks and pitting them against each other so you can like play test it out and see how it actually works. In video 3, what we're going to do is we're going to take some key learnings from the solo play and we're going to refine the deck a little bit more to kind of get it down to something that's pretty close to what will be the final build of the deck, and finally build a sideboard for it. And notice that the sideboard didn't get built until the end, once we actually had a pretty solid idea where the deck was actually landing, and we've played it a little bit and we had some idea of about what it was strong against and what it was weak against. So let's get right to it. Okay, so here we are back with the deck. This deck is as it existed after the end of video 2. And this is that same black-white deck that I've been using to show how to build a deck like engineer. And you know what? I'm going to use the magic of YouTube video photography to speed this up by waving my hands. You ready? Whoop, whoop. There's the deck. It's all here now. Okay, so the things to know about this deck is this is as it existed at the end of the last video. And there's a couple things I noticed when I was playing this deck, so a couple holes that it basically had. There was sometimes too much beef with the Singer Vampires. It was hard to have so much reliance on double black mana with the Specters and the Black Knights and the Hymns. And then also trying to, make room with the strip mines, and so the mana ratio either needed to be brought up or the dependence on black needed to be brought down to some degree. And that definitely created some level of difficulty. Also, this deck was a little bit susceptible to Mishra's Factory, to the Abyss and Wrath of God, and I wanted to put in some Mishra's Factories to get some of that resilience to those creature removal strategies into the deck. So I knew that I wanted to put in, let's say, maybe starting with the Mishra's Factories. So if I added in 2 Mishra's Factories, that ups my mana, and it kind of quasi-ups my creature count a little bit, but it also makes the black mana even harder to get, right? And so how can I, if I'm adding creatures here, I can subtract creatures that take double black, so I can pick my double blacks that I like the least that are actually in this deck. And I take out the orders because you actually have to spend additional mana to make them kind of on par to these guys, and you have to spend more mana to pump them. And this deck is so aggressive, you're trying to hit your opponent really hard and early, so you don't oftentimes have a lot of late game mana to pump into these guys to make them better than the Black Knights. They usually only get better after like some amount of time. So that decreased my reliance, and maybe I can just move those up here. But now when I've got that all decreased, then I need to further decrease my reliance upon black. But I still want to have these like efficient, low-cost 2-drop creatures. So maybe add in an Urg Raiders, and then taking out a Black Knight is an option. So we can go with that one pretty easily. But then I was mentioning I really want to have the Bad Moons in there. And because the Bad Moons are just going to couple so well with all these small creatures. Sorry, my cat's getting on my lap here. She insists on bugging me when I'm in the middle of a video. So I've got all these Bad Moons I want to put in, and especially because like these are a great play when you get an early Stone Throwing Devils and either a Black Knight or an Urg Raiders out off of a Dark Ritual. And they lose their steam pretty quick, but if you start adding Bad Moons into the mix, you start really multiplying up that damage that you're doing, so I want these to get in. But what else can come out? Well, the mana got a little deeper with the additional Mishra's Factories, and I don't always need the additional basic planes because I do have 4 scrubs and I also have the city, so I could probably at least pull out 1 planes. And so that makes room for 1 Bad Moon. And I don't need this much creature beef. I could probably pull out 1 Singer because, you know, along with the bad moons, I'm making my other ones beefier, so that kind of fits that need to begin with. And I don't necessarily have to have all this cool trickery with the Armageddon main deck. Maybe that's a trick that I can play in the sideboard, so that makes room for that. And so now we're back to a 60 card deck, but changes were made based on lots of playing of the last deck. But I want to be very clear on something. That was only 6 cards that got changed. 6 cards came out, 6 cards went in, and the whole time, do you see how I was focusing on it? I was trying to keep the creature ratio balanced, the mana ratio balanced, and I was trying to maintain my ability to blow up control, to clear the board. Like, the deck had already been balanced to some degree, and I kind of wanted to maintain that balance, but I wanted to fix the holes, and that's kind of what you do when you're getting into more of a late game deck design. So now, the next thing to go to is we're going to want to build the sideboard. So let's clean this up. And there we go, got our sideboard here now. Okay, so the sideboard, the purpose of the sideboard is to alter your deck against other decks in the field that you think you're going to be weak against, and just to give your deck some flexibility to go against those, but you generally don't want to mess with your deck theme too much most of the time. You just don't have enough cards in the sideboard to usually completely alter the focus of what your deck is supposed to be going for. So you generally, with your sideboard, want to target going between like 2 to like 6 cards going in or out at any one time, right? If you go a deeper sideboard than that and you're going up to like 8 to 10 cards in, that's going to massively alter the balance of your deck, and you've got to really play test that out before you make a change like that. And so a deck like this, that's all basically like discard and fast creatures and early damage and, you know, a little bit of trickery in it. This deck might have a problem initially against like some really good combo decks, because there's no counter magic inside here. If they put down some really good combo lock pieces, then that can cause a problem. So maybe one of the best controls for that is to just have, I'll start on this side, 4 Underworld Dreams. And Underworld Dreams is just really a fantastic card. I mean, you can ritual these out on turn 1. Even against like my Turbo Stasis deck, these are a huge problem, or against like Brian Weissman's version of the deck or Randy Buehler's version of the deck. Underworld Dreams is a big problem because those decks are constantly drawing cards. That's how they get their entire advantage, and the Underworld Dreams will just chew them up. At the same time, you're swinging at them with creatures and stuff, so they have to deal with these. And if somebody ever tries to play a combo deck against you, like something that's, you know, going to try to like Time Twister a lot, or Winds of Change, or Wheel of Fortune, or play Howling Minds, they're just going to get chewed up. So these are great against heavy draw or like combo decks, basically. Another one to look at is if you're going to go against a burn deck, I opt with a deck like this to go with Drain Lives. And the reason why the Drain Lives are really good is because Burn's entire job is to spend cards in hand to actually hit your life. And so if you can stay long enough to get enough mana to make a Drain Life good, and then you can drain them for like 4 or 5 life on killing one of their creatures or hitting them in the face, you set them back quite a bit. I mean, that might be a 2-card advantage right there. If it's a board state thing, you can clear a blocker off the table and then come back in with all of your attackers again. So Drain Life is just fantastic against a burn deck that's doing everything they can to like rip your life total down. Now, White Weenie is another deck that really has to be considered, because White Weenie tends to have their White Knights, and they have Circle of Protection Black and other things that are very threatening to a deck like this. So Glooms can just come in either against a control deck that relies on white heavily, or against like a White Weenie deck. It's very versatile and it's very good. Now, yes, these will impact some of the spells that you are doing, right? But at the same time, this deck didn't only have the Plows and the Disenchants for control removal. It also had, somewhere in there, let's find it. Where is it, where is it, where is it? There they are, the Chaos Orb and the Nevinrall's discs. So you could even possibly board these for Plows or Disenchants and rely more heavily on these. Or you could just, you know, suffer through it and pay a little bit extra mana so your white slows down, but the deck is mostly black, so that's really not quite so bad. And White Weenie is definitely a threat for mono black. So besides that, you've also got lockdown decks that try to get a lot of lock pieces out, like, you know, Winter Orbs, Howling Mines, you know, Disrupting Scepters, Jame Day Tomes, things that are going to cause problem that like come onto the board and cause issues, or maybe land tax and Land's Edge or something like that. So Nevinrall's disc is just fantastic for clearing out a runaway board state. And notice there was already 2 in the deck, so here's 2 more in the sideboard. So you can now have up to 4 discs in the deck, and they can just deal with a ton of problems. And I've learned to really appreciate the Nevinrall's disc. Now there was 2 disenchants main deck, so we can go 2 more disenchants in the sideboard. And that's also really good for going against like lockdown decks or just artifact heavy decks. You might even board out your Nevinrall's discs if you just think you can just rely more heavily on the disenchants to get the same job done without threatening your side of the board as well. So you get a little bit of that flexibility. Now if one of your opponents is running a thin mana base, which does happen, there's that Armageddon I pulled out. It's just sitting there in the sideboard ready to be played or demonic tutored up and played. And you can try to use this effective strategy where you get a lot of creatures on the board, dominate the control of the board, and then blow up all the lands and then just swing for the win. So Geddon is still a trick that's in your toolbox to be played. And the final one, I've got some Royal Assassins in there. And the reason why these are in there is, let's say you go up against a deck that has better beef than you. Let's say it's got Jazams, or it's got Serendib Efreets, or Urnam Djinns, or just maybe Triskelions or something, just big beefy creatures that you got to deal with, right? Well, the Royal Assassins just do a fantastic job at like blowing those off the table. And so with the discs and the plows and the drain lives and Royal Assassins, you're just going to have a whole lot of ways to get their creatures off the board. And the Royal Assassins also work pretty nice with your new strategy of getting, wherever they are in here, the Bad Moons into play. You might actually even end up swinging with the Royal Assassins for some decent damage. So now we've covered an awful lot of bases with the actual sideboard. So there we go. That's the ending of building the deck and going through that process and all the refining it. We've got a deck now that's fairly like fine-tuned. We've got a sideboard that's like ready to take to your first tournament. And there's a couple notes I want to say about playing your first tournament with this new deck that you just created. So one of the first things you want to do is when you're playing the game against people, you want to pay close attention to a few key details. You want to watch out for dead cards as you're playing the game, and don't just pay attention to just one deck. Against like all the different like games you're playing against other people's decks, and other people are always way more complicated than the solo play, so you really got to pay attention to this. But watch for the dead cards. So what cards just sit there in your hand and do almost nothing, or you just, for whatever reason, you just can't quite cast them, right? And a dead card against one opponent might not be a dead card against another opponent, so pay attention to that and don't get too oversaturated with that, but pay attention. Another thing to watch for is watch for design holes. Like if you were playing like a red burn deck and you thought you could just go straight for the throat and take someone down by turn 4, and you know it hits turn 4, they're not quite dead, and you had no enchantment destruction, and now that becomes a big problem because someone plays like a cop red or something against you. You got to pay attention to that. So watch for design holes in your deck. So you got dead cards, design holes, and then another thing you want to watch for is don't make all your changes for that one deck that you really want to beat. Don't make changes just for one deck that you just want to crush that one deck, right? If you're going to be doing that, you're probably honestly like playing the wrong deck if you have to change so much in your deck to go against that one, right? And if you get closer and closer to changing your deck to beating that one deck you really want to beat, you're probably weakening it to everything else. Because remember, when you went through these earlier stages, you were already thinking about things like, are there any design holes? What's the mana curve in the deck like? How does it ramp out? Am I left turns where I don't have anything that I'm actually going to be doing? How do I put pressure on the opponent? How do I disrupt their actual gameplay? You've already thought through all those steps, and so if you just overdrive on like one specific deck you want to beat, you've probably either started with the wrong build to begin with, or you're just going to ruin your deck design going for that one. So more focus against the field, and sometimes you just you kind of make a concession when you're going to go into a tournament. Like, you know, I know that I'm weak against red, right? And you try to go against red in your sideboard. You build for it, you prepare for it. But, you know, at some point you're going to have to make a concession because, like, not every deck is great against every other deck out there. And so maybe you just sometimes gamble and play the odds, right? Another thing to consider is from this point forward, you've got a fairly good refined deck, right? The changes that you make from this point forward, make small changes. Don't put a ton of different cards in because, again, the deck is balanced. It's made to go against the field, right? If you start changing like 4, 5, 6 cards at a time, you're going to massively change, you know, what that deck is meant to do and how it's meant to do it. Now, of course, there's times, right? Say a new set gets printed, or, you know, you discover a creature you hadn't realized before it's basically like just a direct replacement and it just fits the niche of the deck better. Okay, great, you know, make that swap. But when you make a swap in the deck that kind of weakens it to something, or it basically really changes the focus, like maybe from like hand discard over to mana denial or something like that, be careful with that. You know, maybe make a couple changes and play test it before you kind of go all in on that strategy, because you want to see how it's working. And if you make big swaps and then show up at a tournament, oftentimes, you know, the synergy of that deck that was really working great has just been blown apart. And the final thing I want to say about it is, after you've designed your deck and you're playing it against people, and this is like one of the biggest points, just lengthen the time between all the actual changes to your deck and just be patient. And even if you lose a few games, it's okay. Just play that deck for a while, right? Because if you're going to get good at a deck in a particular archetype, then you need to get good at the strategy of playing that one. So sometimes losing is one of the best teachers you can possibly get, right? Figure out what made you lose. What was the moment where, you know, the control of the game turned over to the other guy? And maybe like the first like 5 games you played against somebody, maybe you were doing it wrong, right? Maybe your deck had all the tools that it possibly needed, but you weren't playing it right. Like maybe you should have held back on that disenchant just a little bit longer. Don't blow up his Mox or something. Wait till he drops the Howling Mine. You know, wait for the right opportunities. Try different strategies with the existing cards that you have. A lot of times what I found is I get an idea in my head and I play that deck with that idea that I've got, and I've run into a situation where kind of the way I was playing it, the strategy, the aggressiveness that I was playing, it didn't really work against that one deck. And I discovered if I just altered my tactic a little bit, held back on a couple creatures, or maybe blew up a couple lands a little earlier than I thought, a couple small changes, all of a sudden the whole game flips around and the build that you have suddenly becomes good. And that is really big, because if I was, like, say, weak against green, and I was getting all ready to make all these deck changes against green, and then I just realized, you know what, if I just board my strip mines out on, you know, the next game and board in like more of like, you know, the hate, but like without less lands, because the strip mines didn't really help me because they got all the mana elves anyways. You try that and you discover you're good against the green. Well, now your sideboard doesn't have to get devoted to green, and that frees you up to be better in your sideboard against decks that you actually are bad about. So those are the tips that I've got for how to design your deck like an engineer. I hope this video series was useful to you guys. And if I have anybody that's watching this video series that is a more experienced player, I hope there was something you could take away from all this, and it wasn't just a lot of noob info. But again, from this whole video series from the very beginning, it was mostly focused on new players and kind of mid-range players. But if you guys found some good tips in this, or if you want to offer up some tips yourselves, please leave me a comment below. I do read the comments. I respond to them as much as I can, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So thanks, everybody. Goodbye. Have a great day.